Boom, boom, boom. Oh, Brian's rocking there. Woo! All right, Ben's dizzy.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Welcome everybody to another edition of the Ben and Ryan Show. So, but like every week, I am joined by my. Oh, I had a good. The Tom Brady to my Gronk,
Sir,
Mr. Ben Nadel.
I do not understand any of your sport ball references. I'm pretty sure that's football though, right? Tom Brady.
It is the football, yes. The American football. So I guess we should say for our international audience. And with us today, we have Mr. Brian Riley. Brian, welcome. He is author of HoyaHaxa blog. So HoyaHaxa. I'll put it in the show notes. And security expert. Brian, how long have you been in the security space?
I've been in the security space a long time. I tried to count, and well over 25 years.
Nice. That's awesome.
Wow. So a lot of experience. And you're here. Do you have any warnings about you're only here on your own? Do we need to add any?
Yeah, no. So I have a day job. I do security full time at a technology company. But also beyond that, I do some of my own research, and that's where a lot of my blog postings come from. Some of that touches on ColdFusion, some of that touches on other stuff, and I just generally like talking about this stuff.
It must be a security thing because the last person we had, Justin Scott, also had to do an official warning that this is me just talking about myself, but you cannot blame the company for anything I say. All the kind of legal stuff. So,
better
but
safe
welcome.
than sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, better secure than sorry, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Absolutely.
There we go. So we're here today to kind of talk through vulnerabilities in ColdFusion, what's been present, kind of is the last year, is it the new normal with a bunch of security updates from ColdFusion? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? And should people really care about these? Or are the exploits so not possible that you really don't need to kind of update? So Brian, welcome to the show to kind of talk through all this.
Yeah, sure. No, definitely. And really happy to be here. I have a feeling that like time-wise, I'm going to jump around and like talk about present day and talk about it in the past.
Totally
but
fine.
At least for me, I think that it started to get interesting a couple years ago. So like March of 2023, there was a ColdFusion security update. And both of the updates in that set of patches were 0-day vulnerabilities. So these were things that were seen out in the wild and were used to break into systems before Adobe officially had patches. And so kind of looking at that made me think and kind of like drove home a couple of points to me. The scarier one was that like that means that even today, so you debate, is ColdFusion growing or shrinking or alive or dying or wherever it is, but like that made it pretty clear that there are people out there in 2023 still looking for new ColdFusion vulnerabilities, still looking to break into ColdFusion systems, and you know what, like that may not be a great metric for like, is ColdFusion still a viable and important platform? But you know what, for some people that means yes, it is. So,
if I can interject for one moment, because when we had Mark Takata on, I think this was in the interview with him, one of the things that he pointed out was that a lot of the places that still very heavily rely on ColdFusion are, let's call them high value institutions, whether it's government or financial. So they're not necessarily out there shouting on the rooftops, hey, we love and use ColdFusion. It's more like we're getting our business done and please don't try to find us kind of a thing.
Right. Yeah. No. And there's a lot to unpack there, and I think the audience can kind of draw some of their own conclusions there about who might care about those vulnerabilities and who might target them. But yeah, like that's a really good valid point. And so after those vulnerabilities were out there, that made me think, well, like, are there still more out there? But also, kind of more importantly, looking at those vulnerabilities, are there things that you can do proactively? Are there things that like a lot of these vulnerabilities have in common? So can you put defenses in today to like prevent yourself from being attacked or being exploited. Let's say the next time one of these new 0-day vulnerabilities is found. So let's say in March 2023, can you kind of study those, understand them, and put in defenses that will help you during the next iteration?
So what are some of the common things that people can do to be proactive?
Right, and so I think there's definitely a lot you can do, and I also think it's important. So we're very ColdFusion focused in terms of what we're going to be talking about, but even that is going to fit into a larger ecosystem. So your ColdFusion server can be totally secure, but if you're not doing the right things at the operating system level, or if you take a step back and you're connected to a network and you have firewalls and you have network equipment, if that's not secure, then you're going to have a problem too. But kind of looking at ColdFusion itself, I think that a couple of the things that are most important, definitely trying to keep your system up to date. So every time Adobe releases patches, or if you're running Lucy or another ColdFusion platform, keep yourself up to date, apply security patches. And I think maybe the other, and that kind of goes across the board. So Adobe releases patches, they release updates to the connectors. Both of those things are important to keep updated. And then I think beyond that, one of the other more important things is to make sure that you're restricting access to the sensitive parts of ColdFusion and the sensitive parts of your application. So definitely the ColdFusion administrator is a big part of that, and Adobe has done things like the lockdown tool and other configurations to keep that secure. So definitely those things are very important.
So I have a question on the most recent two updates, or the most recent two vulnerabilities. So there's flags in the system to say, hey, for variable scoping, as well as the new where they're doing away with the old default encryption algorithms. There's flags in the system now, and they'll be deprecated, but they'll still be there for at least some time period. So people they're like, yeah, you know what? These they're breaking code changes. One of the rare things Adobe puts out is it'll actually break your code. Is it okay for people to leave those flags set? I mean, are these vulnerabilities real? They say no one's been exploited them in the wild yet, but does that mean they can't? I read one of your blog posts that said, hey, you have to have actual physical access to use one of the vulnerabilities. So how much should people care about this? And is it okay for them to leave those flags set?
Yeah, so I think generally speaking, Adobe has said that they're a big deal. They've strongly encouraged people patch and leave the settings enabled. So I think take them at their word, and they're definitely important things. There's obviously going to be nuance there. So I think the variable scoping issue has been something that's been known for a long time. That vulnerability may be a little bit harder for someone to find and exploit just coming from the outside. So if I have access to your source code and I can see exactly how your application works and well, this isn't scoped and so I can get in this way, yeah, then you can piece something together. But I think, yeah, certainly it's going to be a big uplift, and for people who have lots of legacy code, it may be a lot of time put in to make sure that you're scoping everything and you're refactoring a bunch of code. But honestly, that's eventually going to get you to a much more secure place. And I think the fact that Adobe is kind of drawing a line in the sand and saying, you know what, we are making breaking changes in the name of security is definitely a big security net positive. So I think kind of looking at ColdFusion, even based on versus some other languages, ColdFusion long term has been very, very backwards compatible and past version compatible to the point where, let's say you built your application on ColdFusion 9, it would probably still run on ColdFusion 2023. So from a platform level, you would have a much more secure server, and Adobe has patched a bunch of things, but your old vulnerable code from 10 years ago could still run on the latest ColdFusion engine, but still have a bunch of vulnerabilities that you've introduced in your own code. And so I think with some of these new flags and new patches, Adobe's saying, you know what, if you're on ColdFusion version X, then we can guarantee, or we're going to enforce, that it's not going to be vulnerable to this or this or something else, to the point that your application just won't work until you fix those vulnerabilities.
Let me ask Ryan a question, because I've heard that XByte offers managed hosting. And I imagine that kind of puts you in a precarious place, you as a company, because on one hand, you're providing a sense of security to a team that maybe doesn't have this kind of expertise. But on the other hand, you don't want to necessarily do anything that's going to break anybody's site. Because just as a thought experiment, let's say that there became a 0-day vulnerability where it turns out that some URL flag, if it, some series of encoded bytes in the URL caused a problem. In theory, I assume XByte controls all of the network traffic coming into your managed servers. You could maybe put a firewall rule or something in place that says, we're just going to reject this if we find this pattern. And that might, block 90% of the bad traffic, but maybe blocks also 10% of traffic that accidentally falls into that bucket. Do you, as a company, feel a responsibility to jump in where you can, or is it very much we're just going to alert all of our customers to let them know that this is a possibility, and here's steps that they need to go into their IIS and add request filtering flags? Or, how does a company that's doing managed hosting dovetail with, overstepping versus hand holding? There's a question there somewhere.
I can give you an example from these most recent 2 exploits, because we've, as they came out, we advised our customers, hey, you've got to update. I mean, there's and we had a large number, I think 80% do it pretty quickly. We're pretty good about communication.
Nice.
and helping them through and saying, hey, look, we're gonna get you to the next version. At least upgrade, because there's other security updates as well. So at least upgrade, set the flag, and have some sort of a path for yourself to update all your code from the scoping issues. But if it was something where we could do something to block it, and there were known exploits that have been used in the wild, I think we'd have to block traffic, and just tell our customers, saying, hey, guys, there's too much at risk for everyone else if we don't block this. We have never seen an issue where someone's gotten from one customer to another, but you never know when. Right. In our virtualization platform, if there's also a 0-day, that someone then uses a hole in ColdFusion to get to a server, then exploits a 0-day in our virtualization platform to get to everybody else. And so,
sorry, this is the scariest thing about security, is because and because you struck a chord there, maybe, because when I've been trying to wrap my head more around the deeper functionality involved in containerization and Docker and all the process isolation, you read through these tutorials and how do I get a Node.js Docker container up and running? And inevitably, from a security perspective, they'll say principle of least privilege. You don't want the thing running your node process to have, sudo admin access. But then there'll be a note that says, yeah, but containerization is totally isolated. And then there's another note that says, yeah, but what if it's not totally isolated? You're like, I'm just trying to understand Docker. Now you're giving me caveats on caveats on caveats. That feels terrifying.
Okay, so again, we've never seen it, but so I'll give you another real world situation where we had someone that we migrated over. We found that there was somebody who had been in their environment for probably 2 years skimming credit card information.
Oof.
They had what happened, and Brian, I think, talks about some of this, is they had left open ASP.NET ability, or no, sorry, PHP ability to execute PHP code in a ColdFusion server. Well, obvi, they're not running PHP code. So, but these guys, whoever did this, was able to get through to be able to upload a file. There's different techniques in sites in the past that allow you to be able to upload a file. If you have a form that allows it and you don't properly cleanse data, you can upload a PHP file. And then if you're using the traditional download path, Then if someone knows that, they upload the file, then they can access it through a URL, and then they can now all of a sudden be able to load wherever they want to onto your system. So they had done that, and they brought that into our network. But we found it pretty quick. We found it immediately before they were ever in production. But the second we found it, we helped them cleanse everything. We looked through the code. We showed them, hey, here's what it is. You can see all the PHP files. This is what they're doing. We found the hole they had, and we helped them patch that. And then once we did that, we've got to then do searching across our network to make sure that no traffic came across different servers. And so we did our own audit of all of our systems to make sure that we're still protected. And so unfortunately, that's what you have to do. I mean, because there's no guaranteed protection, that there's not something you're not aware of. You've got to do all your audits to ensure that all the rest of the customers are protected.
And going back to this idea that it's what Brian was saying, that it's not just necessarily in the ColdFusion code that you write. It could be in the application server. It could be at the OS level. I actually was hacked years and years ago on managed hosting, ironically. And it wasn't even at the ColdFusion layer. I'm on a Windows VPS, and I don't even understand really how IIS, Internet Information Servers, work. But apparently whoever had configured my managed server had allowed the put verb to work at the IIS level. So someone actually uploaded a file through IIS, and it never even hit the ColdFusion application server. And I'm just not a security guy. I didn't even know that was a thing that could happen. Sorry, I feel like we've blocked Brian out of our conversation.
No. I'm thinking, and Ben, to your Docker point, I think that there's like so many layers, and let's say the person building Docker or writing the documentation has no idea how the end user or the end customer is going to implement it. So there's so many variables, so many kind of unknowns, and you know what? Like if you deploy it on like a single user server in a locked room and fully controlled, then some of those things don't necessarily apply. But if you build it in an entirely different environment, then yeah, some of those things of like least privilege and this and that may be really, really critically important. But also, yeah, I think the other piece there, kind of jumping back a little bit about some of these flags, security and availability go kind of hand in hand. And a lot of these times you also have to think, you know what, is the cure worse than the disease? So there's going to be some vulnerabilities where, you know what, you absolutely want to make sure you're secure, and it's definitely going to lead to a breach, or it's definitely going to lead to a really, really bad situation. There may be some other times where, you know what, it's better to keep your application up and either like log errors or log warnings until you can really fix it. And so like one of those examples is some of the discussion around the CFMX compat encryption. So it's like that was one of the changes that Adobe recently made, but it's been documented. It's been in the ColdFusion documentation for years and years and years. It's weak encryption. Don't use it. It's discouraged. They called attention to it, but lots and lots of legacy applications probably implemented it because it was the default, or developers didn't think about it. And you know what? I'm going to call the encrypt function. That sounds secure, but I don't realize I'm getting this weak encryption. But even something like that, like you can think about it that, you know what? Yes, it's known to be weak, but where does that data live, or how's it being used? And so definitely if weakly encrypted information is exposed to the user, then yeah, it's easy for them to crack that or modify that or do something else. But on the flip side, if that weakly encrypted data just lives in your database and an attacker would already have to get into your database to see that, you know what, then you can maybe hedge, or you can say, you know what, if an attacker is in my database, my day's already ruined. And maybe it's a little bit worse if I'm using weak encryption, but honestly, if an attacker is in my database, I'm worried about more things than what encryption algorithm am I using, and is it really secure, kind of secure, or not secure at all?
Well, this is The one along those lines that always gets under my skin a little bit in terms of security best practices and prevention worth the difficulties. This idea that you should almost never even have secret keys in your environment at all. Like, not just don't store them in your code and commit them to the repository, because that's, a red flag, but just the idea that you should never even have them in memory except in a very transient way. And I always think to myself, someone will say, oh, well, if someone breaches your machine, they can just dump the memory and look at your environment variables. And I'm like, once someone breaches my machine, do I even care that they can dump the variables? Like, they've already taken over, they've already won.
That's a great example too, where again, that's kind of worth thinking about and understanding kind of what threats are you worried about, what situations are you most concerned about, what situations are you trying to fix, and so like exactly, there may be some environments where everyone knows you shouldn't have secrets in code, but maybe it's kind of sort of not the worst thing in the world, because like you said, someone breaches your system, and so secrets in source code they can grab. But if they're, let's say, stored in an environment variable, maybe the attacker just needs to do something a little bit different. Or even if they're stored in the secrets manager, maybe it'll take the attacker a little bit longer to realize, well, hey, they're here, and I need to do X, Y, and Z, and it's not that simple. But also one thing to keep in mind too is that, like in the secrets example, you may be worried about your secrets living in lots of different places. So let's say you have a secret in source code. Your source code may live in your repo. It may live on your servers. It may live on your developers' laptops. And so all those things, like kind of as that information spreads or propagates, instead of knowing, my secrets only live in my secrets manager, I'm only concerned about this one attack path or this one scenario where they get exposed, versus, well, my secrets have fanned out into 10 different locations. And so now I need to worry about, like, am I keeping all those 10 different locations? And my developer just went on vacation, lost his laptop, and now do we need to worry about, like, those secrets getting exposed that way? But certainly if you're like a one-man shop and you're at, like that may be acceptable risk for you. If you're a Fortune 10 company, maybe not, or maybe your security team or your auditors or someone else will have something to say about it.
Or some 3-letter government agency, they probably are a little more protective of things. Yeah, when you were talking about, hey, for the scoping variable issue, is like, hey, someone needs to be able to see your source code to then be able to see there's vulnerabilities in what you've written. From what you just described, that's a realistic vulnerability. I mean, especially if you're a high profile, someone may, the doggy. So someone may find it worthwhile to be able to get into your system and find that source code. I mean, weren't there like Sony hacks and other hacks that were games that got, or scripts for movies got stolen? So you got to think, if that's possible, then someone stealing some source code is probably possible, and then they can figure out the scoping issues. Now all of a sudden there's a vulnerability that you thought was just a no big deal because no one has your source code, but they do.
We had a catastrophic issue at work one time, and the company's over, so I think it's okay to talk about it now. And it's not like anything bad happened. It was more like a stop the world situation, and it wasn't even our fault per se, depending on how hard you squint. We were using all kinds of containerization, and so essentially we had a CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment system. It would pull down the code, it would build an image, it then would push that image to an image registry, and then that's what Kubernetes would deploy that image. The CI/CD system that we use, which was a third-party service, had a vulnerability in it, and they had some sort of exploit where someone was able to get into the CI/CD system. And I don't remember all the details exactly, but the CI/CD system needs access to, I think, a bunch of our environment variables because it builds stuff and pushes things places. and we ended up having to rotate every single key in our entire environment, like in our entire ecosystem, because we weren't exactly sure like where the touch points were that may have been exposed by building through the CI/CD system. Sorry, it's really hard to say that, CI/CD system. Oh man, it took literally days to get it done, because every team had to push code to trigger new builds, to pull in new environment variables, and all of it went to this queuing process, because on these CI/CD systems you pay for the number of concurrent builds. So we only had a certain number, so every team was getting queued up behind the other teams. It was a total nightmare for something that wasn't even our quote unquote responsibility. I mean, it was part of our stack, but it wasn't code that we managed. But that's the interesting thing about application development. I've always, not always, but earlier on in my career, I always thought about ColdFusion as this black box, this sort of monolithic thing. But when you peel back the layers, it's not one thing. There's the ColdFusion code that's proprietary, but it wraps a whole bunch of third-party jar files that it pulls in and other things, and it sits on JS. What is it? JSV. The servlet
JVM, or
whatever Tomcat is, whatever the servlet container technology is, like that's a whole other thing. And you know, when we have to stop what we're doing and apply these patches, it isn't necessarily even Adobe's fault. Like Log4j, I don't know if that's the March 2023 one you're talking about. Well,
yeah, no, that was I think that was a little earlier. The March 2023 was some like native Adobe stuff.
Right. So Log4j, just for the listeners' understanding here, Log4j is a Java library that does logging, and it had an exploit in it where you could create a remote request based on some logging content, and so you could essentially ping servers from data. And it's not code that Adobe wrote. It's not code that we would write as consumers of the product, but it's down there in the bowels of the system, and we suddenly become responsible for fixing it, or applying a patch. And that's, I mean, there's no broader statement there other than this stuff is very multifaceted and very nuanced and very complex. And security isn't one thing.
I mean, in the pre-show, we drew the comparisons to WordPress, where if you're a WordPress customer and you're constantly patching all of your plugins because people exploit the plugins all the time. For a short amount of period of time, I was at a company who did have WordPress, and I mean the number of people trying to attack your admin page for WordPress was amazing. Within an hour, I think, of us publishing something for the first time, there were attacks against our admin page. And so you're having to do things like similar things that Brian recommends, block by IP address. So only certain IP addresses can access parts of the system. If you're gonna allow it to be open to the public or on a public IP address or a public website. So similar things that we had to do is we could block that. We had to be like joined to the domain to have access to it. So actually, you couldn't access it from outside. So all different kinds of things. You're adding firewall protections to protect these pages, along with putting them in not. I think, but the first day we had it in the default location, which you really should never ever do.
It's like WP-admin or something.
Yeah.
So
we're like, let's change that. Let's make sure we don't have that in the easiest way possible for someone to kind of hack into us. But yeah, we see all the attacks. It's crazy, and I'm sure with Log4j when that was out, people were figuring out how to get access to that, or all the CF hide for the CF admin. People I'm sure they're always pinging ColdFusion sites to see who's not patched for stuff like that.
Yeah, no, and I think it's also an important point that the attackers are just pinging sites. So I'm sure people see PHP attacks and WordPress attacks against their ColdFusion sites, even when they're obviously not running PHP or running WordPress. So like if you're on the internet, you have this stuff just being fired at you, and your company probably isn't being targeted. Your company isn't being specifically cased, but it's just like I'm going to try you, I'm going to try the next one, and then eventually, if something is open or something's not fixed, it's going to be found. But yeah, no, your WordPress example is definitely a good one, because ColdFusion is a pretty complex piece of software. There's like the Java piece, there's all the Java runtime stuff, there's the engine itself that takes your ColdFusion code and turns it into the code that's being run. There's all the management piece, so your CFadmin stuff, all the API stuff, all the additional add-ons, all the third-party libraries. So yeah, that's a lot of software. That's a lot of software that can have vulnerabilities. Even before you sit down and write one line of your own code, there's a lot of stuff that you need to worry about. Is there vulnerability lurking in there? Are there things that you need to fix? But also the Log4j one is interesting too, because like depending on how pragmatic you want to look at that. Fortunately, at least everything that I've seen, and everything that Adobe has said, and everything that third-party folks have said, ColdFusion itself was never actually exploitable for Log4j. So certainly, like ColdFusion had a vulnerable library, Log4j, some version that did have a vulnerability. But in terms of how ColdFusion used it and how it kind of fit into all the pieces, you couldn't actually exploit Log4j via ColdFusion. And so like so plenty of other third-party pieces of software that had Log4j. So I think like Minecraft, for example, you could exploit Minecraft over the internet like via Log4j. And if you sent someone a message that had a Log4j type exploit, like you could exploit like some local workstation, some desktop, some laptop running Minecraft. ColdFusion, fortunately, wasn't actually exploitable in that, like, if you send it Log4j stuff, unless you really specifically built custom Java stuff using Log4j and then exposed it, which like virtually no one is going to do, like you could make yourself vulnerable, but like standard operations, standard installs.
You really tried hard.
Just not going to be vulnerable. That being said, if you ran like a security auditor on ColdFusion, it's going to throw up red lights and red alarms, and definitely something that security conscious customers would say, you know what, this has to be fixed right away, even though kind of in the grand scheme of things, it may have not been urgent for ColdFusion. So that it's tough because you don't want to unnecessarily have fire alarms, but you also want to make sure that you're patching and fixing the important stuff.
That's the really tricky thing about some of the security triage work, is that for people who are general application developers, they don't necessarily have the instinct or the wherewithal to decide whether something is legitimately problematic. And I know when GitHub, for example, introduced its Dependabot alerts, where it would just scan all your code and tell you everything was wrong. And, you know, if you don't necessarily know that the catastrophic regex backtracking vulnerability, or like the prototype pollution thing that's in some 14 levels deep in your node modules folder doesn't ever actually hit production because it's only a build time issue, you know, it's like, it's hard to know, is this something I actually have to care about, unless you're going to stop and do the research. But, you know, everyone has deadlines, right? Nothing's casual at work ever.
Right. Yeah, no, and that's a great point too. And I think, like, honestly, in terms of some of the Dependabot stuff, that's almost more of a DevOps issue than a security issue. So like, if you can get yourself in a position where it's easy for you to just upgrade and test and always be on later versions of modules or libraries, regardless of what your platform is, that's going to be great, because then it's, you know what, there's a new release, and whether it's performative or security or something else, you know what, like I can update, I can test, I can see, will this work, and then I can always be near the latest or on the latest, regardless of why I need to upgrade. But yeah, definitely, like not every Dependabot alarm has to be like end of the world, because yeah, like you're exactly right. There's plenty of times where, you know what, yes, there's some vulnerability in some library, but like your application's not using it, it can't be reached, it can't be exploited. So yeah, that's a really, really good point.
And it's tough too when the people who are in charge of implementing the security practices are not the same people who are writing the code, because they don't have the context for what all this means necessarily from an application standpoint. I don't know GitHub all that well, but I know at one point our operations team had turned on some sort of feature where it would start not just the Dependabot stuff, but it was like a whole nother set of security vulnerabilities that it would start to list. I don't know if it was some integration with Sneak or something.
Mm-hmm.
And I literally had to go in as part of my deployment and explain and get approval from the ops team as to why this wasn't actually a vulnerability. And then they had to take it off the list and mark it as approved. I mean, it was very frustrating, but I think we eventually stopped doing that because everybody got super frustrated with it.
Yeah, no, and that works both ways, because obviously security teams need to build and maintain that credibility. And if I'm on a security team and I'm sending you pages and pages of bunk vulnerabilities, you're eventually going to ignore everything that I send your way. So yeah, like definitely, like there needs to be that triage in there. At the same time, it's not always feasible to like triage every single vulnerability. So if you have one application and one platform and you're only ColdFusion, it may be easier for you to spend a lot of time on this versus if you have a portfolio of like 1,000 applications and you have some Java and some ColdFusion and some PHP and some .NET and some mainframe and whatever else, like a vulnerability is a vulnerability is a vulnerability, and you want to kind of like fan all that out and uplift all of your stuff. So yeah, no, it's there's unfortunately kind of no easy solution, and sometimes it's, you know what, like address the red stuff first, address the orange stuff last, and then file away the green stuff for a rainy day.
So Brian, for our listeners and watchers on this, you've done a lot of writing on security, and so if they're curious to be able to understand what are true vulnerabilities and what may not be a true vulnerability. So if they're on a security team at Ben's company and they're trying to help them out and really recommend issues, where do they find that? Are there publications out there that you in the security space look at, or where should they start?
It really depends, because like honestly, even just to kind of narrow focus on ColdFusion, there's so many ColdFusion patches coming out and so many ColdFusion vulnerabilities coming out, and sometimes it's, you know what, take Adobe's guidance, and if they say this is important, patch this. I've spent some time looking at some specific vulnerabilities or looking at some specific ColdFusion patches to see exactly, well, how does this work, and what are the scenarios where someone would be able to exploit it. And like, yeah, there's definitely been some ColdFusion vulnerabilities where, and again, this gets back to the Docker example where you don't know how it's going to be deployed. But I've seen ColdFusion deployed in like some typical ways where, let's say it's behind a connector and there could be like web server access controls or a web application firewall or a load balancer, and that may be typical to me. And so kind of assuming that that's normal, like those controls would prevent vulnerabilities where you need to have direct network access to a ColdFusion server. But you know what? Someone may have decided, I'm going to deploy my ColdFusion server in a totally different way and expose some stuff to the internet that maybe isn't typically or isn't recommended to be exposed to the internet, which could make one thing not important to me, but really, really important to this other organization.
Well, okay, so this brings up, I think, just a broad point possibly to make explicitly, which is that there is a healthy tension, let's call it, between convenience and security. And the more convenient something becomes, typically the less secure it becomes. It's awful to have to remote into a server just to access the CFIDE folder because the port's not exposed publicly, but like that means the port's not exposed publicly, which is great. And if we look at a bunch of these other things, like the log4j, the reason log4j was an issue is because someone tried to make some facet of it very convenient for some weird little edge case, which made it insecure. Or like we had it wasn't a vulnerability per se, but we use image magic, or we used image magic at work. And one of the things you could do was overlay an SVG on top of another graphic, but SVG is XML, and XML, and for whatever reason, decided to allow file includes as part of the XML protocol because they wanted to be convenient. And now it's a security problem. I mean, there's, you know, I'm sure 1,000 examples of like CFIDE. You want to do some sort of ColdFusion built-in rich editor on the front end, and it conveniently loads a script from some sort of scripts folder that's secretly mapped through IIS. Like, that's convenient, but now it opens up another vulnerability. So I guess the broad point that I'm trying to make is, don't make your stuff convenient. Like, when in doubt, don't be clever and don't try to make something more convenient that it has to be. And to pull it back to one of your presentations, Brian, in the presentation you had sent us, we were talking about don't make ColdFusion components remotely accessible. And maybe I'm just like an old fuddy-duddy who was pre-CFC code. Like, I would never make a CFC remotely accessible because CFM files are pages, and I would just wrap access to it in a CFM. Like, there'd be no need to have that slightly more convenience of like serialization and deserialization of JSON payloads and whatnot. Anyway,
and those are all great points, because like convenience is going to be important, security is going to be important, your application being up and functional is going to be important, and so that's honestly one of the things that drove me to kind of dive into some of these vulnerabilities, where I can say, looking at like years and years of ColdFusion vulnerabilities, a lot of them required being able to access CFIDE. And so like that's one of those examples where I'd say like 100%, like the security risk of exposing that to the internet or an untrusted network trumps like any benefit that you're going to get from ease of use for that one. You know what, like, say, like, not having to type a 20-character password versus like a 14-character password make it a little bit easier, or debate things like that. But definitely, like, if I can kind of send home two messages: one, protect your CFIDE, so like don't expose it to the internet, make sure that it's really, really locked down. And then the other piece, the remote ColdFusion component stuff, that was something that I learned after looking at how a number of these ColdFusion exploits worked. They all had to hit one remote ColdFusion CFC file, and so that was like, even going back pre-March of 2023, but like the vulnerabilities in March of 2023, and then later that year there were like a succession of a new one was found, and then someone learned how to bypass that, and someone learned how to bypass that. But like, let's say in March, let's say you said, you know what, I'm going to block CFC files from being requested from my web server. That would have just by nature protected you from the thing that was found 6 months from then, and then another month from then, and then 2 years later. So it's kind of balancing that. And if you're not using remote ColdFusion components, really, really easy to block those. On the flip side, if you have a whole huge application where everything is written with remote components because they're API-like, and you happen to embrace that, that's going to be a lot harder to say, you know what, let's back off from that. And that's similar to even some of the scoping questions. If you can easily scope your variables and fix it easily, do it. But some of these, like, depending on what your application looks like, or some of the earlier choices you made, it may be harder to put some of these preventions or some of these temporary fixes in place.
Now, with the scoping issue, one of the things we've been hearing contradictory information on, and I'm still waiting to kind of hear back the official Adobe position, because I've heard that it's going to be not allowed, like it's be enforced in 2025, and others where that flagged override is going to still be there. And so I don't know if Adobe's taking more of a hard stance, saying, "Hey, look, we gave you a few months, but we believe it's a big enough vulnerability that we can't allow it any past 2025." So it'd be interesting to see how much of a hard line they take and decrease that deprecation time period.
Yeah, no, everything Adobe has said about that, I think they're driving home the fact that it is a big deal. But yeah, that's definitely going to be a big product change, because then you also run the risk of, you know what, I'm on ColdFusion 2021 and I have all these unscoped variables. I'm going to stay on an old, unsecured, not getting patched platform because I can't go to the latest. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of hard product decisions that have to go into things like that.
Now, when I'm using ChatGPT to write my code, should I just make sure to prompt it with use best practices and don't open any vulnerabilities?
Yes. Make sure the code yes.
Done. Solved.
I have gotten some very suspect answers from ChatGPT and other AI when I've asked ColdFusion and ColdFusion code questions.
I will say though, one thing that I've been always so impressed with ColdFusion vis-a-vis OWASP top 10 is that from day one, or at least from as far back as I can remember, we have had SQL injection prevention basically baked in by the platform with the CF query param tags. And even if you just embed raw strings into your query, you really have to jump through hoops to preserve single quotes and stuff to make sure that you can bypass. Like, we really just as a product knocked it out of the park as far as the SQL injection. You really have to work hard to make your site vulnerable, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, and that was a change that I think happened to over time. And I may be going back to really, really ancient history and some ColdFusion dark ages, but I know like there was a time in, I think, the early to mid 2000s where there was actually a lot of automation targeting ColdFusion applications, like just crawling the web, blindly exploiting, looking for SQL injection. There were like malicious tools that you could find online that were, and this was, I think, before Google locked down some of their search API keys, where so you could basically use Google, find like hundreds of thousands of ColdFusion applications. And I should dig because I think I have it somewhere in an old presentation, but it's really, really scary about like how some of these things worked. And they basically like hack ColdFusion applications, find SQL injection, and I think they just like inject a bunch of malicious JavaScript so that like now in your ColdFusion application, you were getting served malware or you were getting served ads that was generating money for someone, and it was just crawling the internet and hitting site app, not caring if it was getting .gov or .edu or like your mom's flower shop. It's just like crawling the internet and finding what it could find.
Yeah, I mean, I know MySpace in the early days was built on ColdFusion. I think it was like ColdFusion with .NET DLLs running or something like that.
Really?
Like, I think it was Blue Dragon was maybe what MySpace was running on. And they they have one of the most famous worms of all time, which is not necessarily a SQL injection attack, but it was like the one guy hacked something so that he would automatically friend everybody else. Yeah,
that was the Sammy worm, named after the researcher that wrote it and then introduced it. And yeah, that was like cross-site scripting, and it took advantage of a Microsoft Internet Explorer bug. So basically, like lived on MySpace, and then everyone who hit MySpace with a vulnerable version of IE, it would propagate from like page to page to page, and I think like kind of brought the site down that way just because of load and impact.
Crazy,
Brian. I'm gonna bring your presentation here for a second up here, and I just want to make sure because there's some great information in the next couple slides. Have we covered everything on this slide?
Yeah, and so this is what we talked about a little bit. So like we're very ColdFusion focused, but there's all this other stuff. So like your application doesn't live in a vacuum. So you're going to have ColdFusion, and that lives on an operating system, and maybe that lives in a virtualized environment. And then it's talking to other servers, and it's talking to a database. And then there's your web and edge components. So certainly kind of knowing what that looks like. So like you can lock down ColdFusion and you can lock down CFadmin, but if you're running on like an ancient version of Windows Server and you're exposing remote desktop to the internet, you could wind up in a world of hurt, even if you're running ColdFusion 2023 or ColdFusion 2025 with all the latest patches. So yeah, just kind of like when we're talking about security, we really want to care about the security of the whole system. And so like you need to break down all little pieces and understand how all of this works. And that's really what goes into like making sure that you're thinking about your attack surface and thinking about what threats and what vulnerabilities and what attack patterns you're most concerned about.
I will say that as we've migrated customers to our cloud platform here at Xbyte, we have definitely found people using old, out-of-date, unpatched Windows. Unfortunately, they're also probably the ones running old 10-year-old versions of ColdFusion and just easily out there. And who knows what's going on with some of these guys? And they're lucky that no one's found them yet. But it's amazing what people are not doing. And so just kind of good best practices out there to look at your system hardening and to not only ColdFusion, but make sure everything's up to date. When you're Windows, make sure you are running a Windows that is patched. And now
Can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
Going back to the previous slide, though, as far as the just building a defensive mindset, one of the things that we just offhandedly mentioned earlier was OWASP, which is the Open Web Security Application Project, I think is what the P stands for. Anyway, it's a really, really fantastic website and project, and they have a bunch of cheat sheets, but they have the OWASP Top 10, which comes out every year, and it's really worthwhile just sitting down and reading through those and understanding what the injection attacks are and the insecure object access and I don't even remember what the names of these things are, but they're abstractions on what the actual issues are from a technology perspective, and it's very helpful to just have those in the back of your head whenever you think about, I need to access this record. Well, how do I know that the user requesting this record has access to it? And it just puts you in that constant kind of mindset of distrust, which is very helpful.
That kind of goes along with what we just talked to Grant from Curios, where he's using blockchain to ensure people have access to stuff. So if you're listening to this one, you'll see it already published out there. But there's a show Brent and I just did about some of that. Like we talked about this and this other one, I don't know what we can see here. I want to make sure that we've covered everything on this one as well. And yeah, here's Ben, what you just talked about.
The OWASP Top 10.
Yeah.
There you go.
And yeah, like that last bottom bullet. So like that's all the other stuff you need to worry about. So your network, your platform, your databases, all that. And we even see that with ColdFusion, because some of the ColdFusion patches that get released aren't really ColdFusion patches, but they're security patches for Java, or they're security patches for Tomcat, or some other third party piece. And you know what? It's hard for a developer to know, is this something that Adobe's taking care of, or is this one of those pieces or third party things or components that I need to get from Microsoft, or get from some other vendor, or get from whoever wrote or provided me this custom piece of software.
This is exactly my huge point of frustration as being a quote unquote application developer, not necessarily a security expert, or, I don't really know much about servers. So when I think about ColdFusion, the Java and the Tomcat stuff feels like it's part of the product itself, not something I really need to know about. But I also, I'm a customer of Pete Freitag's Foundio service, Hack My CF offered through its Foundio company. And every week it sends me an alert that my Tomcat has a vulnerability in it. But I'm like, I don't know what to do about that. Tomcat's, I'm painting with a broad brush, but I'm like, Tomcat's part of ColdFusion. Like
Right.
if Adobe's not going to fix that, I don't know what to do about it.
Yeah, no, and that's a good piece, and it's even hard for Adobe in some cases because the ColdFusion connectors were a great example of that, because that's code that was shipped with ColdFusion. It's had vulnerabilities. They've updated them, but for a long time, and I think even now, they don't get automatically updated when you patch or upgrade your ColdFusion. There's like a manual step that's required. And over time, with some of these vulnerabilities, Adobe's done a good job of drawing attention to that and saying, yes, a connector update or a connector rebuild is required there. But if you're just like glossing over the advisory quickly, you may miss that. Just like with the Java and Tomcat pieces, I'm not a ColdFusion expert. My understanding is there's like a bunch of ways that you can deploy ColdFusion because it's a Java application. I think you can deploy it with all the stuff that Adobe gives you, but I think you could probably like shoehorn it and make it work in some other Java environment. And so like you may be running a different servlet engine or a different Java engine and all these things. And so like there isn't always one size fits all advice or like there's not always one path to security. Because if you're doing something that's non-standard, you may have to do different stuff over time as there's new vulnerabilities or new problems that arise.
Yeah, like the Ortus Solutions guys who built Command Box. I think when they spin up a Command Box server, I think it's not running on Tomcat. It's running on like Glassfish or something.
Yeah, on what is it? I'm blanking.
Well, let me throw this to Ryan then, because I'm not an XBite customer at the moment, but
we are working on that.
We're getting there.
Slow to move.
So if Pete Freitag is saying, "Hey, your Tomcat version is out of date," and Adobe's not doing anything, is that something that a managed hosting provider would help with, or is that kind of too far below the surface of
I do believe you can actually update Tomcat outside of Adobe as long as they support that Tomcat version. I believe it was again, I'm relatively new in the last year and a half to the Adobe space, but I've listened to Dakota, our CTO, who's been in the Adobe space for many years. And I believe in his presentations, he talked about looking at that version, making sure that's up to date, making sure your Java's up to date. So as a service, we do handle any of those components that can be updated. We do handle that for our managed customers.
Oh, music to my ears, my friend. That's the other thing that Pete Freitag's Hack My CF stuff will tell me, that there's some, I don't know, issue with my Java version. But again, I'm like, the Java version comes with ColdFusion. I don't know what you're talking about. And then he has this note about, it's like you can't actually get the right version of Java from Oracle. You have to go to the OpenJDK and like download a special version. I'm like, bro, you lost me here. Like I need a team. I need a guy for this.
It's a licensing thing for why you can't use the Oracle. The ColdFusion has a special license with them, so you've got to go through a certain set of steps to get access to it.
Next slide.
I think those are the big ones. Those are the big ones that I wanted to cover. These are all just extra slides about that, about topics. But those are the ones I wanted to make sure that, because as I was reading over the presentation, those were kind of like the summary slides that I thought would be good to kind of, let's as a checklist after the fact, let's make sure we've touched on those topics because of the audience. Want to make sure that we kind of give them the value of that. And Brian, is that slide deck public in case anyone wants to access it on your blog?
That is linked off of my blog.
Let me ask you a question, Brian. And this is a debate that I have had many times with my platform team or my security team, I guess, and no one has ever agreed with me. As we alluded to earlier in the conversation, there are just people scanning sites constantly. we run ColdFusion, we're getting WP admin, all kinds of stuff. And I have many times gone to my security team and said, look, any IP address that makes a request that contains ... /Etsy/passwd, I'm like, that's not a legitimate person. We should just immediately ban that entire IP address. Like, I don't care what else they request. And their take on it is always, no, it's just you're chasing a moving target, and new things are going to come in. And then I guess there's also an issue because so many of these are sort of spun up botnets, or not botnets, but like, someone purchases an hour on 10,000 machines at AWS. You can't just be banning IP addresses willy-nilly, because eventually you'll maybe block valid traffic. Anyway, my question is it ever okay to have this kind of poison pill mentality where a single request can sort of cascade turn off a bunch of other things? Is that just a terrible idea?
Yeah, like a lot of things, and so I'll say that, like, unlike a lot of the other people you've had this debate with, it's definitely not a hard no. It depends.
I saw Ryan shaking his head no.
Yeah, no,
like in disgust.
like you can't, because there's IP addresses are oftentimes are not single to that user. That's where you run into blocking the good traffic.
Yeah, so it depends, and it even gets tricky because sometimes identifying the IP address isn't always super easy. So like there can be misconfigurations, and I think, Ben, you may have blogged about the exported 4 header before. Like there's possible misconfigurations because, again, these are complex systems, and before my web browser talks to your web server, it may go through like a proxy on my end, a bunch of stuff in the middle of the internet, like your edge, your reverse proxy, your load balancer, before it even touches your web server. And so, like, even identifying what's the real IP address that I want to block, or has someone modified this in such a way where I'm going to get it wrong. Like, let's say, think of what would happen if I send one of these bad requests and I can trick your server into thinking, well, hey, it's really coming from like AWS, or it's really coming from one of your important customers, or it's coming from someplace where you need to do a transaction with. So there's a risk there. If you're confident that you've gotten that right, and you can say, you know what, like, I know who my customers are, I know who I need to allow.
I just thought, like, nothing bad has ever happened from someone very confidently being, I've got this.
So like again, some organizations may say, you know what, the benefit of blocking everyone who requests WP admin against me is worth what the downside is going to be, because I have one customer, and like they're this one government IP address, and I'm okay with that. Now, if you're Instagram and you have customers around the world and all kinds of devices and all kinds of networks and IP reputations, you're probably not going to do that, because how you want things to work is like, So and the flip side of that also is, like, you're running ColdFusion, someone requesting like admin.php does nothing to your server. So it's noise, it's junk. Like,
that's the pushback always.
It's illegitimate, but you know what? Like, there's so the biggest value is you've identified them as a bad actor, and maybe you want to record it some other way. But like blocking them, kind of depending. There's probably a threshold where you do want to block them, but kind of one bad request or one anomalous request may not be where that line sits.
And I don't know enough about the security to answer this question, but could you at least temporarily block that session? So if you've identified that session's a bad actor, then just at least stop them from testing out every form on your page for SQL injection. Although you should be using ColdFusion and be blocking that, but maybe there's something that's not ColdFusion on your site or something that now there's a vulnerability.
Yeah, that would definitely, like you can probably implement just about any control that you want, and then it's just a matter of like, you know what, like everyone's probably getting scanned right now. Is it super important that we block it? Is it even super important that we know about it if there's really no impact? And so yeah, so like you can, I'd say whatever you decide to do, make it almost seamless and invisible, where it's just like part of how your platform's going to work.
I'll say so. We used Cloudflare as our web application firewall, our WAF, and one of Cloudflare's claim to fames is that it will automatically block denial of service attacks. And I will say, I don't know if you have to reach a certain scale before that really kicks in fast enough. But you know, if we're running 5 servers, 7 servers, what we would find is that our servers got overwhelmed way before Cloudflare saw it as high enough traffic to kick in. And I don't know if this is the platform people should have been in there tweaking. I think it's one of those things where it just wasn't worth their time, maybe. But I know that there are things that you can do at the very outer perimeter of your application, but it's one of these difficulties where it's not the person who's building the application. It's like several teams removed, and they don't see the same things that you see, and you don't have the same insights that they have. And it's a communication problem. And I don't know, WAFs are great, but I've also found that they fall short of the panacea that I think they're sometimes billed as.
It also depends on the subscription level of Cloudflare that you have. They have a much more expensive platform or payment schedule that you can get on that does a lot more of that.
Okay. So maybe we weren't using the good stuff.
And then your hosting provider, be it the actual data center itself, not necessarily the company who's doing your hosting, but the data center itself, how they have their inputs can also play a role in that. They're whoever they're using for connectivity. Some of the better ones will have their own Cloudflare-like thing that says on top of it, though, that is actually watching for any kind of dedicated denial of service attacks, and will stop those and kind of actively prevent them. So those are other things you can look at, as depending on your hosting as well as your level of Cloudflare.
Yeah. Also, and I think Cloudflare is a great service and a great company and does lots of good things.
100%. I am a customer of theirs.
Yeah. No, I'm a big fan as well. And even I think they were in the news recently where they recently like detected and blocked some like the biggest DDoS attack ever seen on the internet, and like they release that great PR every 6 months. But even with denial of service attacks, there's different kinds. So like some are going to be like using different protocols. So some use ICMP, so like just overwhelming you with like pings. Some use UDP. But if it's a web-based denial of service attack, that's really, really hard to say. Like, is it someone DDoSing you, or like is your site really, really popular because, and I'll date myself now, but like you made the front page of Slashdot and everyone is going to your website. So like again, that last situation, you can go in and kind of tune that and tweak that and set that all that up with your Cloudflare rules. But I don't think a lot of that happens automatically because like again, Cloudflare doesn't know, like, are you getting DDoSed by too much web traffic, or are you just really, really popular from like millions of users all over the world?
Yeah. And the thing is,
if it was that easy, it would be very nice.
Absolutely. And it's also, as an application developer, I don't even have the right words. You know, I can go to the security team and I could just say, stop making it hurt. But like, they don't know what that means. They don't know how to put that to numbers. And that's a real challenge because they're just, tweaking and guessing at that point.
So the general rules that we've talked about today is you've got to attack it in many ways. You've got to you've got to harden your system. So if it's your hosting provider, if you're on-prem servers, whoever's doing your on-prem server management, making sure they're doing the things to harden the non-ColdFusion stuff. Rely on ColdFusion, keep your stuff updated. Rely on your security team to identify vulnerabilities that you may not be looking at, and then entrust them as they're doing their audits to your code, that they're auditing it for the right stuff. So it's a multifaceted plan to make sure you're protected.
Absolutely. And it's a journey. Even as someone who's been doing this for a long time, I'm learning security best practices newly and as well over and over again.
All right. So Brian, thank you so much. I mean, this has been a great talk about security and kind of protecting people. When I first saw your write-ups, I was like, all right, perfect. I can have someone to come and talk about security and help. I don't want to scare people, but any of our 20% who's not updated to be like, hey, look, see, Brian, he told you to update. These are real. These aren't pretend vulnerabilities. So I'm very glad you were able to make it and join us today. Any last words for us? Do you want to promote your blog to make sure that everyone knows how to get to it?
Yeah, sure. No, thank you very much. This was great, and I like to talk about this stuff. A lot of times when I'll research or I'll focus on things, I really have like the blinders on, and I'm looking at something very specifically. So a lot of times I'll write about a vulnerability, and it's kind of up to the reader to draw some of their own conclusions about how it applies to their environment. I'm much more comfortable talking about like the vulnerabilities and the exploitation, because all that is a contained system, and I can see how that works. I won't necessarily know what does your whole environment look like. How would you fix it in your environment? Because there's so many variables. But yeah, certainly if folks want to read more, like Ryan said at the kickoff of this, the blog is HoyaHaxa.com, HoyaHaxa.com, and I'm sure it'll be in the show notes and elsewhere. But thank you very much.
Awesome.
All right, and
great having you.
Yeah, great having you. And
Thank
guys,
you.
if you're on his blog, please chime in the comments, and reply to kind of get some discussions going on security. And it'll be good for everyone in the audience or everyone in his audience to kind of learn from your questions as you're posting them in the comments. So please participate in all that.
First person to successfully post a persisted cross-site scripting attack gets a special prize.
Yeah, we should do some special prizes leading up to the ColdFusion conferences. We'll set some stuff up. But yes, thank you guys very much for everyone watching, listening around the world. For Ben, for Brian, I'll steal Ben's closing because I do it every show. Because I like his better. So cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
Sure.